Hello, and welcome back to the STAAR History Blitz Social Studies curriculum. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez, and we're going to continue learning about our social studies curriculum in bite-sized pieces. So, let's get started. Today's video is on the physical characteristics of the 13 original colonies. Here are some key detailed points on the information that we're going to be covering. Let's remember that the European countries that colonized North America were Britain, France, and Spain. Here are the physical features that make up North America today. Let's look at these oceans. On the east coast, you have the Atlantic. On the west, the Pacific. You have the Great Lakes up at the north and the Gulf of Mexico down south, including the mouth of the Mississippi, the port of New Orleans, which opens up from the Mississippi River. You also have the Ohio River and the Missouri River. We have the physical characteristics of the Appalachian Mountains on the east coast and those of the Rocky and Sierra Nevada on the west coast. In going over the 13 original colonies, it's important to know that they were divided into 3 regions. A region is a place with similar characteristics. So in this case, the characteristics that make up that region are the climate, geography, and the economic activities. These 3 regions are the New England Colonies, which you can see in the blue area, the Mid-Atlantic that we've colored in green, and the Southern Colonies that are in red. Let's get into detail about the New England Colonies. These colonies consist of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Their climate and geography will determine their economy. That means how their weather is and the land will determine what they're going to do to try to make money. In this case, the New England colonies have a very cold climate with very long winters. That means it's cold for a long time. So because of that, when it comes to growing crops, they have a short growing season. They have rocky soil. They also have swift rivers, that means it has a current, dense forests, that means there's a lot of trees, and natural harbors. What is a natural harbor? In simple terms, it's when the ship can get really close to the land. So here are some pictures to illustrate their climate and geography. So cold winters, rocky soil, dense forests, rivers, swift rivers. Here's another one for dense forests, and of course those natural harbors. Now, because of their climate and geography, this is going to determine their economy. Since they didn't have a lot of fertile soil, they had to look around and say, what can I use that's around me naturally that can make me money? So they started looking at the fact that they had dense forests. They can use that timber to build ships. They used the swift rivers to transport their ships. They had natural harbors with abundant sea life, so they could go fishing and they could dry that fish and ship that fish out. They can also go whaling. Now, they did have subsistence farming, and subsistence farming just means they can grow crops, but just enough to survive for themselves, not to make money off of. So again, going back to their economy, fishing, whaling, shipbuilding, fur trade, timber. They had port cities such as Boston. They would ship out the dried fish as well. Here are some images that represent the economic activities. On the top left-hand corner, you have whaling, in which they'd get the blubber from the whale, heat it up and make it into oil and put it into these barrels to ship out. You have the timber that would use the swift rivers for transportation. Some small farms with livestock, abundant sea life, and fur trade. Let's move on to the middle colonies, also known as the Mid-Atlantic Colonies. These colonies are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, their climate and geography also determined their economy. They had warm or mild weather, also known as moderate, so it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold. They had good soils with rolling hills. They also had a really important natural harbor that became New York City, one of the busiest seaports in the East Coast. Because of their climate and geography, they were able to grow some crops, specifically grains like oats, rye, flour, barley, wheat, and all of these grains could be made into bread. So the Mid-Atlantic Colonies became known as the Breadbasket Colonies. And also just a quick little tip to remember, oats, what religious group settled there? Quakers, Quaker oats. So the Quakers grew a lot of oats. Let's move on to the Southern colonies, which, as you notice, are much larger. I like to call these the Five Sisters because their names are all girl names: Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. So that's a quick little tip. If you ever have a question and it has a girl's name, it's a Southern colony. So here you have them once again. They were primarily founded for economic reasons, but remember, Maryland was established by the Catholics and Georgia was established for social reasons. Nonetheless, they all did end up growing crops, and let's see why. Remember, their climate and geography will determine their economy. They had very hot weather and a lot of super flat fertile soil, and fertile means they can grow crops. It's suitable for growing crops. They do have a long growing season as well. That means it's hot a lot of the time and their winters are short, the opposite of the New England colonies. Now, what did they do? Because they had hot, flat, fertile soil, what kind of crops were they growing? Well, they were growing what became known as cash crops. Crops that they could grow to sell, not just to survive. These crops included tobacco, rice, cotton, and indigo. Because of this agricultural economy, though, they depended on slave labor. So these large farms that used slave labor were known as the plantation system or plantations. So keep that in mind. Any colony with a girl's name, they were growing cash crops. They used slave labor. They had the plantation system. Here's a picture that illustrates a plantation system. Here they're growing cotton. Here's another picture that shows the plantation system in which the slave labor is harvesting tobacco. They're hanging it from the rooftops where the hot sun basically cures it or cooks it. So the plantation system was a large reason for the economic success of the Southern colonies. Now, why was there a large demand for this cash crop agriculture? England had developed an economic system known as mercantilism. And basically, it just means that England controls who the 13 colonies trade with. England tells the 13 colonies you can only buy and sell to us. So they controlled all the imports and exports. The 13 colonies would export or sell raw materials. Then England would make them into finished goods or manufactured goods and sell them back more expensive to the 13 colonies. Because of the economic demand of that cash crop agriculture, England allowed the 13 colonies to trade with Africa in order to get that slave labor. So the 13 colonies would export rum, so they would sell rum to Africa, and Africa would sell the African slaves. So it was a trade, rum for slaves. This became known as the transatlantic slave trade. That concludes our STAAR History Blitz for today. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez, and we'll see you next time.